Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating piece of history. We're going to unpack the brilliant, step-by-step master plan that transformed a massive, desperate migration into the rock-solid foundation of an incredibly complex society. We're looking closely at the arrival of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina and the immediate, highly strategic steps he took to build the very first Islamic state. We've got a lot of ground to cover today as we look at the pillars of early state building. We'll be walking through the arrival and the first mosque, forging bonds of brotherhood, the Constitution of Madinah, the first call to prayer, the seekers of knowledge, and finally, we'll wrap up with the legacy and future of this brand new state. All right, let's kick things right off with Section 1, Arrival and the First Mosque. So picture the scene. The Prophet arrives in Medina, and the streets are just packed. Men, women, children, everyone is overjoyed. But, this immediate excitement actually created a massive diplomatic challenge. Every single tribe wanted the honor of hosting the Prophet. So how do you pick where to stay without bruising any tribal egos or showing favoritism right out of the gate? Well, to solve this completely impartially, the Prophet allowed his divinely guided camel, Qazwa, to make the choice. He basically told the eager crowds, "Leave her, for she is commanded." So Qazwa slowly walked through the city and eventually knelt down at an open courtyard used for drying dates. Now, this land belonged to two young orphans, Sahal and Suhel, from the Banu Najjar tribe. When the Prophet dismounted, he simply asked whose house was closest. Abu Ayyub al-Ansari stepped right forward, and that was that. The Prophet stayed as his guest. That exact plot of land was later purchased to build the Prophet's mosque. Honestly, it was just an incredibly tactful, brilliant way to settle in. Now, actually, before that camel even entered the city center proper, a really crucial first step was taken on the outskirts of Medina at a place called Quba. It was here that the Prophet established the very first pillar of this new society, spiritual infrastructure. He laid the foundation for Masjid Quba, which is famously recognized as the absolute first mosque in Islamic history. And its profound significance is forever immortalized in the Quran, specifically in Surah At-Tawbah, verse 108, which beautifully praises it as a mosque founded on righteousness from the very first day. Moving right along to Section 2, Forging Bonds of Brotherhood. Okay, so the state is established, but they are immediately facing a massive socioeconomic crisis. You've got the migrants from Makkah, the Muhajireen, arriving essentially homeless and entirely stripped of their wealth. The solution to this was the Muwakhat, which was a pretty radical social welfare system. There's a verse from Surah Al-Hashr, verse 9, that perfectly captures this moment. It praises the local helpers, the Ansar of Medina, who went way, way beyond basic charity. We're talking about people literally splitting their homes, their wealth, and their properties directly in half to support their new migrant brothers. And crucially, this wasn't just some vague announcement to, be nice to the new guys. No, it was a highly specific, deliberately organized pairing of individuals to rapidly integrate the society. Look at some of these famous historical pairings. You had Abu Bakr bonded with Khadija bin Zaid. Umar was paired with Utban bin Malik. Abdurrahman bin Auf with Saad bin Rabi. Zubair bin Awam with Salama bin Salama. And Abu Ubaidah was bonded with Saad bin Mu'ad. By tying these specific leaders and citizens together, the society was instantly fused from a diverse, fractured population into one single, unified family. But, there's a deeply touching footnote to this whole event. When all the pairs were finally made, Ali was actually left without a designated brother. According to the historical texts, he was left in tears over this. So the Prophet stepped right in, took his hand, and formed this profoundly emotional bond directly with him, saying, "Are you not pleased that I am your brother? You are my brother in this world and the hereafter." I mean, talk about turning a moment of isolation into the ultimate honor, right? All right, let's dive into Section 3, the Constitution of Madinah. So Medina wasn't just made up of Muslims. It was a really complex demographic pie. You had pagan tribes, you had very powerful Jewish tribes. To prevent civil war and actually govern this massive diversity, the Prophet drafted the Meeqaat-e-Madinah. Historians widely recognize this as the world's very first written constitution. And the genius of it was that it wasn't an imposed rule. It was a mutual treaty, signed and agreed upon by all the different factions. If we distill the source text down, we get 6 revolutionary points. First, the concept of one ummah, meaning despite their different tribes, they were now one unified political community. Second, complete religious freedom. The Jewish tribes would keep their religion and the Muslims would keep theirs. Third, mutual defense. If Medina was attacked from the outside, everybody had to defend it together. No one could shelter an outside enemy. Fourth, they set up a shared economic and blood money system, known as diyat, which essentially replaced endless tribal vengeance with a structured compensation system. Fifth, absolute justice for all citizens. There was zero room for oppression. The oppressed had to be helped, regardless of what tribe they belonged to. And finally, in cases of dispute, the final authority and supreme judge was the Prophet himself. Think about how wildly advanced that is for the 7th century. This document basically took tribal chaos and overnight turned it into a structured, pluralistic welfare state.
Which brings us to Section 4, the first call to prayer. Okay, so you have your civic laws established, but a society also needs day-to-day operational structure. Specifically, how do you organize daily congregational gatherings when nobody has a wristwatch? Initially, they actually deliberated using signals from other religious traditions, like blowing a horn or ringing a heavy bell. But then this really unique spiritual intervention happened. Two companions, Abdullah bin Zayd and Omar, both had distinct divine dreams where they were taught the exact specific words of the Azhan. When they brought this to the Prophet, he confirmed it was indeed a true vision. He then instructed them to teach these words to Bilal. Why Bilal? Because he had the most resonant, powerful, and beautiful voice among them. And so, standing up high on the roof of the mosque, Bilal delivered the very first soul-stirring call to prayer in Islamic history.
Next up, Section 5, the Seekers of Knowledge.
A truly successful society can't just run on laws alone. It absolutely requires education. And that brings us to the state's very first dedicated educational institution. Right inside the Prophet's mosque, a raised platform called a sufa was built. The individuals who lived here were known as the ashab-e-sufa. Now, these were primarily impoverished migrants who didn't have families or homes in Medina. But rather than this just being a homeless shelter, it evolved into a rigorous, full-time academy. These companions completely detached themselves from worldly comforts to dedicate their days and nights solely to learning the Quran and religious sciences directly from the Prophet, who personally saw to their care. They were essentially the state's very first full-time university students and scholars.
Finally, Section 6, the Legacy and Future.
So, we've just seen how the vital foundations of faith, unparalleled brotherhood, constitutional law, and education were masterfully laid out in the early days of the city. But as we leave you with this breathtaking dawn over the newly formed state of Medina, one massive, looming question remains. This is a fragile, newly built, almost utopian state, and it is entirely surrounded by enemies. How in the world will it defend itself against the heavily armed wrath of Mecca and the intense political struggles that are just on the horizon? Well, you'll have to find out in our next explainer. If you found this deep dive into early state building as absolutely fascinating as I did, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell icon so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible story. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.